So the word genocide confuses a lot of people, I think, because it is thrown about pretty loosely in conversations on YouTube, but also by countries. For example, Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of committing genocide in Donbass prior to the February 24th invasion of Ukraine by his forces. In this video, I want to use my background as a lawyer, because I am a lawyer by training, by profession, to explain, and I'll try to make this not too geeky and too legalese as a lawyer, but basically give you an overview of what genocide actually is and how it's actually quite specific and quite a high bar to prove legally, either that it has taken place or is taking place in many ways, and actually a little bit different to what most people imagine on the ground, actually with the facts of what happens, and also then apply it to the case at hand, which is the February 24th invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
SAR Experience.
So Article 2 of the Genocide Convention lays out what genocide is from a legal perspective. And it means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy. So there's actually two parts to it. There is a physical part, which is acts, which are going to be enumerated in a few seconds, and the intent to destroy. So there's intent. So there's a mental component to it as well. It's not just the physical act. And in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So it's limited to these four categories. And then it enumerates the actual physical acts. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So killing members of the group, I think that's pretty clear. That means killing them, so causing their death. But it goes further than that. It says causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. So you can see it's also not that you have to cause destruction or kill all of them, because that's also just before that, further up in the text, in whole or in part. So you don't actually have to kill them, but you can cause their physical destruction. So think of something like a famine, for example. You wouldn't actually kill the person physically yourself, but you would cause about their destruction if you put them somewhere and don't allow them have any food or sustenance. Well, then they die, so it's the same thing. And you don't actually have to kill them or bring about their death, so you can cause serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth, so if you sterilize the people, this happened unfortunately several times throughout history, and also forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So you take them out of one group, you take them and put them in foster care, for example, whole or in part of the group. Yeah, so that's also quite interesting, because we'll get into what happens in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, but basically if you were to, as I said, transfer people and say, well, now you don't live there as, I don't know, an Aborigine, maybe in Australia, I think this may have happened, or also in Indigenous people or Native peoples in Canada, they were taken from their families and then put in different families so that they would kind of forget their culture, stuff like that, and brought up. I think it may have happened also with people from Greenland at one stage in Denmark. So in the case of Ukraine, we're looking for a national or an ethnical group. So whether you consider Ukrainians an ethnic group or they're definitely a national group, they're definitely a nationality. So there you could say it could be the entire idea of being Ukrainian, for example, or it could be people who are DNA, if we could say that really, but or an ethnicity related to each other as being Ukrainians. Definitely we can see that in Ukraine's case it would mean Ukrainians or a subsection of Ukrainians to be destroyed deliberately, so it's got to have the intent. In whole, so all of them, or in part. The in part is quite important in the case of Ukrainians. So a lot of people, when they hear the word genocide, they think of Nazi Germany, what actually happened, which is, say, the murder of Jews, or the attempt to have the final solution, as it was called by the Nazis when they had their Wannsee conference during World War II, which is when they decided to kill basically all the Jews. And they also persecuted other groups like Roma. Well, at least when I went on my tour of Auschwitz, I've been there a couple of times, it was explained that actually they were still building crematoria at Auschwitz, the extermination camp, which is located today in Poland. Obviously, the Nazis were in charge. They had killed as many Jews as basically they get their hands on, and they were planning to kill other nations after that, and in particular Slavs, right? So people have always imagined that image of putting people in gas chambers, or the Holocaust by bullets that happened before they came up with the idea of killing people quicker and covering up their crimes easier by using gas in gas chambers and then cremating the bodies to destroy the evidence, which was part of the final solution. That they shot people basically in pits in a lot of the places that during Operation Barbarossa, for example, which would have been in Ukraine, modern-day Ukraine, or Belarus, or Russia, or in the Baltics. It doesn't have to be that kind of dramatic an image and involve killing absolutely everybody from the group. It could also be in part. So that's an important element to remember when we try to analyze exactly what is happening in terms of a genocide in Ukraine. And it's also important for me to point out that even if you don't have a genocide legally, that doesn't mean that there aren't horrific war crimes taking place and that the whole behavior is reprehensible. It just means that that specific crime of genocide wouldn't be present in that case. And that has a different set of legal consequences that I'll also get into. So it's not that if there isn't a genocide, that's only, there's no genocide, why are we worried? It just means that all of these are going to be war crimes, all these elements, whether killing people illegally is still, in a time of war, still a war crime. It just might mean that there's actually a genocide taking place. So in no way does it absolve horrific behavior and crimes if it doesn't reach that specific legal requirement to constitute genocide. So as a reference point, what in the past can we say was genocide? So we have a good idea of what we're talking about. Well, relatively recently, in the 1990s in Europe, there was a series of wars called collectively the Balkan Wars. They affected countries like Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Albania, Macedonia, which is now Kosovo, obviously. Whether you recognize it or not is a little bit more debatable. It's now, I guess, recognized as an independent country as a result of the wars. But there you did have an international tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, criminal tribunal, and it found many people from different sides guilty of war crimes, but it found only Bosnian Serb leaders guilty of the crime of genocide. They were actually convicted of genocide, and there were other leaders who were going to be on trial, were on trial, actually went to see Slobodan Milosevic on trial in The Hague, where the court was set up, where they had the proceedings, and he actually died before the end of his trial, and there was another leader, the leader of Croatia, Tudjman, who died actually before he could be brought before the court to be tried to see if he was guilty. He also might have been potentially facing charges of a similar nature. So that is a good example of where genocide in Europe was prosecuted and people were convicted of it. But historical genocides, obviously we're talking about Nazi Germany, the Second World War, very obvious one that I think everybody can relate to. Also, you have what countries now describe as a genocide or tend to recognize controversially, maybe like the Armenians at the end of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey is the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, so you often hear of the Armenian genocide. Other genocides, we had the Rwanda genocide, and you did have criminal prosecutions coming out of that as well. Afterwards, that happened also in the 1990s in Rwanda in Africa. You also had the Holodomor, which was a genocide perpetrated by Stalin when he won the Soviet Union against people that would have been Soviet citizens. So in Ukraine, there was actually two time periods where that took place. You had it in the 1930s, and you had it just after the Second World War as well. So that affected parts of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, parts of Russia, I think parts of Central Asia, like in Kazakhstan. And in that case, it involved mass starvation in the Holodomor. Actually, it comes from the Ukrainian word for hunger. So there you can see as an example where there wasn't a deliberate killing. He also killed a lot of people deliberately, or he's especially his secret police, the NKVD, killed a lot of people, Stalin, but also can involve things like mass starvation. When we look at this war in Ukraine, we have several elements that seem pertinent from that list. If we look back at the list, killing members of the group, well, clearly there are a lot of Ukrainians being killed, so that seems to be present, causing serious bodily or mental harm, arguably also there as well, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of, life calculated to bring physical destruction, partner and whole. So is there starvation? Well, not yet, I think, but you see the controversy around grain and the export of grain and agricultural produce being destroyed in the region. Is that going to mean there's going to be, hunger in Ukraine or elsewhere? Maybe. Imposing measures to prevent births. I don't see evidence of that. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So there's been also a lot of controversy about people in areas that Russia are occupying being sent to Russia, into different parts of Russia. So there we have definitely several elements that are, prima facie occurring in Ukraine at the moment. The really key element is not that you have the facts, the physical acts taking place. It's actually the intent. So the intent has to be to deliberately destroy in whole or in parts. So that's the important distinction. What may be the final solution, which was the attempt to exterminate Jews in the world, not just in Europe, by Nazi Germany, is that, well, they wanted to kill all Jews, but actually if they were trying to kill a part of them, that would also constitute genocide. So it's not actually there has to be intent to kill every single one of them. That's also pertinent as we examine in Ukraine what's taking place. So let me start my analysis of that point by reading a quote from an associate professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, which is actually my alma mater. This is actually where I studied international relations myself. I mentioned that I also have a legal background, worked as a lawyer for many years. And Eugene Finkel, he wrote a book, Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust. So this is one of his fields of expertise, genocide. So let me read the quote for you. Though evidence of this shift is abundant, one of the most explicit examples is an article titled, "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" published on April 3rd by the Russian state-owned media outlet RIA Novosti. So this is actually an article that I have referenced in my other videos. It's a pretty shocking document. I'll put a link to it down below in the description so that you can go read it yourself. If you don't read Russian, just do a Google Translate. You'll get the gist of it. And he's just referring to that at the beginning of the war, that his view is that Russia didn't go into Ukraine with the intent to necessarily commit genocide from his point of view, and that this has happened subsequent. Echoing the arguments made earlier by Putin and other Russian leaders, the article outlines a clear plan to destroy Ukrainians and Ukraine itself. After Russian victory, it argues Ukraine is impossible as a nation state, and its very name likely cannot be retained. The Ukrainian nationalist elite need to be liquidated. Its re-education is impossible, but a substantial part of the populace is also guilty and would require re-education and ideological repressions lasting at least a generation and would inevitably mean de-Ukrainianization. So there he refers to, arguments made by Putin and he says other leaders, in particular Medvedev, who was the Russian president for a short time. Then he was also the prime minister of Russia, so definitely a big political figure. And both of them, both Putin and Medvedev, wrote articles essentially saying that Ukraine doesn't exist or shouldn't exist, and that basically Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are one people, and Putin is slightly less aggressive in his language than Medvedev, but basically they outline arguments for getting rid of Ukraine and the idea of Ukrainians. Yeah, that wasn't maybe as explicit as in this article, which uses words like to be liquidated, and that sounds like killing the elite. So think of something like what happened in, I think it's Katyn, in Poland in 1939 when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland together because they were collaborating at the time. There was a massacre perpetrated by the NKVD, which was the Stalin secret police, and they tried to basically eliminate the Polish intelligentsia. So this is pretty similar because its re-education is impossible. But it also talks about, on top of the elite, a substantial part of its populace, and it says also guilty, so the crime of being Ukrainian apparently, and would require re-education and ideological repressions lasting at least a generation. So that basically means some form of attempt at brainwashing the population. So that would probably be in the Genocide Convention, Article 2B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. If we're trying to do this kind of re-education, inverted commas, brainwashing of the population will also, it says ideological repressions, but it means liquidating, it means murdering the elite of Ukraine, so killing all its leaders, whether they're political, cultural, probably more than that, any kind of business leaders, and then taking the rest of the population and basically trying to brainwash them. And they intend to do that for at least a generation. I guess generation, we say, what's that, 20 years? It would inevitably mean de-Ukrainization, which means basically destroying the whole idea of being Ukrainian. So what is RIA Novosti? So you have to look at it like, it's not just like some Russian paper published this. Russia basically has very little freedom of speech. The fact that this paper, which tends to publish, or this media outlet tends to publish a lot of the most aggressive, I would say, genocidal talk or most nationalistic talk that we see in the mainstream Russian-controlled media. It's all effectively now, especially since this war started, I don't know if there's any independent media of the Russian state left in the country. It's basically all state-controlled, and in order to say something, at least repeatedly, it would seem to be close to impossible unless you have the authorization of the leadership in the Kremlin. So the fact that this has been said represents definitely a strain within the Russian political elite that this is the way that they're thinking, right? And I would say since more or less the beginning of this war that the rhetoric has become more and more aggressive. Putin, 2 days before the war, what did he start his speech with? Which is effectively a declaration of war. Oh, no, he didn't legally declare war. Also internally in Russia, he wants to call it a special military operation. It's a war, it's an invasion. He said that Ukraine has no right to exist independent of Russia's sphere. He used the word inalienably connected to Russia, and that Ukraine's borders are illegitimate. It's basically an imperialistic war that he's unleashing. He also gave the impression, I think, in that speech that he felt personally betrayed by Ukrainians because they had made this decision as a collective to go westwards as opposed to look eastwards like they had in the past, to basically want to join Western institutions like NATO, like the European Union. The reason that they want to join, I outlined in a previous video, I'll link it up above on a card down below in the description, before the war was basically the promise of prosperity. They look at countries like Poland and the Baltics, and they joined the European Union, also NATO, and they now got a GDP per capita 4 times that of Ukraine, at least 4 times before this war started. It's probably obviously a lot more now, and actually twice that of Russia. It's even higher than Moscow, the oblast, right? So that is pretty crazy to think that those countries that were obviously a lot poorer than actually around the same level as Ukraine upon independence, and now they're 4 times got the GDP per capita. And what did? They joined the European Union. In order to do that and feel protected, they also joined NATO, because NATO has an Article 5 protection, which basically means a security guarantee from the US. Because in the European Union treaties, there's also a mutual defense clause, but that would mean depending on Germany and France coming to your aid. And obviously, so far when I speak on day 106 of Russia's invasion, Germany and France are not looking that reliable to come and save countries like Estonia, maybe if they were to be invaded by Russia at any point. So it definitely seems that there is a certain section of the political elite in Moscow that endorses committing genocide in Ukraine. So let's look at what's on state TV. Just take some clips. Okay, so I'm going to start with a top Kremlin propaganda. This guy is like mainstream TV, on state TV obviously, and he is just there, it almost seems like a daily basis, spewing out justifications for Russia's invasion of the war. His name is Vladimir Solovyov. Not sure if I get his pronunciation of his name correct, but let's listen to some of the things that he says. Remember, this is state TV, this is prime time kind of stuff.
А у нас в России патриотический консенсус, который звучит так: до конца добивать нацистскую гадину. Вот я себе представляю людей там, кто
Знаете,
теперь эту мразь будет пытаться
Я
брать в плен?
всегда, сегодня
So there he starts off by saying, let's finish off the Nazi scum. And then he says, like, why are we even taking POWs? So there he's talking about committing war crimes, obviously, killing prisoners of war, it would seem, by calling them Nazis. So this is actually something you see a lot in Russian propaganda, which is that Ukraine is a Nazi country. Also, Putin referenced this in his speech before the war as a casus belli, is that Ukraine is controlled by Nazis, or there are Nazis, I don't know, everywhere in the armed forces, political elite, and that's why the country needs to be denazified. It's a term basically that's come to mean that anyone who resists Russification of Ukraine is basically a Nazi. That's the way they're labeled. Think of it the way it's pretty similar to what I guess the Nazis did by calling Jews or other people they wanted to exterminate. They called them degenerate, basically called them Untermenschen, and they said that they were less than human. So obviously it's less than human, then we can kill them easier. And when you think about it, calling someone Nazi definitely makes you, if you buy into that, definitely makes you less sympathetic. And killing a Nazi, is that the same as killing a normal person? Probably for most people not. So there's another way to dehumanize those in Ukraine who resist Russification and resist this war of invasion, this imperialistic war of invasion.
Предаю тебя, Вовка Еленский, анафеме.
Никакой ты не еврей. И никакой ты неверующий человек. Ты чистый, дешевый бес.
So there he starts calling Zelensky the devil. This could be looks deranged.
Ваша сатанинская нацистская власть, безбожный враг
Украины.
So here he calls it a satanic Nazi government.
Для нас нет задачи сохранения вашего государства.
So he talks about no need to preserve the nation. So obviously Ukraine shouldn't have existed. Let's go on to another clip.
Войска ДНР и ЛНР сражаются за свою землю. А вот дальше вопрос, а за что сражаться теробороне? Там нет их земли.
И войска ЛНР, ДНР сражаются за свою землю, и армия России сражается за
вот
свою
как раз
землю.
So we have another clip where you see Margarita Simonyan, who's head of RT. So RT is state propaganda in English. You may know RT, Russia Today, as a channel. And she's a major figure within the kind of propaganda network on TV and whatnot. Obviously, if you're head of RT, Russia Today. And there they describe the Russian army is fighting for its land, and the Ukrainian army is not fighting for anything that it's supposed to have, I guess. So they're basically saying that it's Russian land, it's not Ukrainian, so Ukraine doesn't exist.
мы говорим людям, вспомните, кто вы есть. Посмотрите, что с вами делают.
And then he says, remember who you are. He's trying to tell Ukrainians, or the Ukrainian soldiers, you're Russian, you're not Ukrainian. Ukraine isn't a thing. So he's kind of denying that Ukraine really exists. He actually says that almost comically that Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk people, they exist, but Ukraine doesn't. Obviously, this is a fiction. Ukraine does exist because we recognize it. It's been internationally recognized for over 30 years.
Почему вам придумывают мову? Вам нужен тот суржик, на котором пытается с вами разговаривать Зеленский?
Нет, конечно.
There he describes Ukrainian as Surjik. Surjik is this mix of Russian and Ukraine that's spoken a lot in, like, say, villages in Ukraine where people kind of use the words and the grammar from both languages. It's not actually a set of, it's not really a dialect, a fixed dialect or anything like that. And he basically describes Ukrainian, the language, as Surjik. Zelensky, obviously the president of Ukraine, speaks, even though Zelensky himself, important to point out when he's calling it a Nazi government, that Zelensky is Jewish and he's actually Russian speaking natively. But none of this matters to him.
А встречать будет еще больше, когда поймут, что мы никуда не уйдем.
And then he says they're never going to leave. So that's obviously, he doesn't think that the Russians should ever go. There's not anything other than an imperialistic war. Let me just deal with the last clip from this crazy lunatic.
Совершенно не обязательно нацизм должен быть антисемитизмом.
Да, конечно.
Это то, что американцы все время склеивают, говоря о Зеленском. Но он же еврей, он не может быть нацистом.
So what I actually read is this guy is also Jewish, by the way. And then he has to deal with the obvious fact, if he keeps calling a Jewish president a Nazi, for most people, especially, as I started the video by discussing the Holocaust, they think, well, Nazis tried to kill Jews, so how can Jews be Nazis? That's a little bit illogical. So then he has to deal with that, especially after Lavrov made these very bizarre comments equating Jews being Nazis themselves. And, Putin apparently had to even apologize to the Israeli prime minister. So they went into panic mode here.
Еще как может. Цизм может быть и не антисемитским, а может быть антиславянским, антирусским.
Конечно.
So now Nazism to them is being anti-Russian or anti-Slavic.
Мы наблюдаем сегодня по возрождению глобального нацистского проекта. А почему глобальный проект? Я сказала, глобальный нацистский проект. Потому что Украина – это место, откуда начинается вот это возрождение.
So this sounds like something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you know what it is, an anti-Semitic pamphlet from the 19th century that was used to stir up pogroms, murder of Jews in the Russian Empire, with a big plot that Jews are trying to control the world. Here, this so-called political scientist says that basically the West, Great Britain, I think I should go say America next. Of course, United States, the EU, that basically they got this plot to have global Nazism. And what does it mean?
Не только против даже вот как антисемитизм против русских, но против всего, что связано с Россией.
So there they try to equate just being against Russian imperialism, in effect, as being Nazism. Well, with such a broad definition, then basically there's probably billions of people who are going to classify as Nazi. That's a very important point. It's like, especially when we're dealing with genocide in Ukraine, because there is the majority of Ukrainians who don't want to be in this new Russian Reich. Let's call it what it is. It's a Russian Reich. It's a Russian empire. And they're labeling anyone who resists Russification as being a Nazi, and again, dehumanizes these people. And of course, she throws in its own Western plot to turn everybody against Russians. Ukraine isn't a thing, basically. Just want to give you another example, put this up on screen, from the Russian Orthodox Church. Remember, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has supported and blessed this war. And this apparently was posted by the Russian Orthodox Church. If you are a Russian warrior, your duty to erase the Ukrainian nation from the face of the earth. And there's actually a TV station run by members of the Russian Orthodox Church, at least. I'm not sure if it's Zargrad TV, and they speak in very similar terms. There you have kind of almost like a messianic religious overtones to destroying the idea of Ukraine. Again, meeting the intent part of the requirement under the Genocide Convention. Then it gets even more explicit, because we've already there established that at least part of the Russian elite, these people are pretty senior within the ideological elite. They're basically conveying the message on a daily basis to the Russian public.
Простом выражении 2 миллиона человек. Вот которые сейчас и готовы все это делать. Которые готовы СС возрождать. Потому что Азов это и есть фашистский СС. А ВСУ это вермахт. Ну это же очевидно так и происходит. Вот эти вот 2 миллиона человек должны были либо уехать с Украины, либо должны быть денацифицированы. То есть быть уничтожены.
So there you see that they're talking about 2 million Ukrainians who this guy is classifying as incurable, i.e. that they're likely to resist. He clears them, again, this thing that they're Nazis, been labeled on them, or Nazi supporters, I guess. That's 2 million people. He's saying it's 5%, that'd be about 5% of the Ukrainian population, and that they should have been left, or they need to be denazified. And for him, denazi means destroying them. Exactly the wording from the Genocide Convention. So this guy is pro-genocide because it's not 40 million Ukrainians, it's part, and definitely 2 million people is pretty significant. So this is Genocide Talk, mainstream, primetime Russian TV. And he calls it a civil war, basically saying that Ukraine is no place. Let's deal with the re-education.
Когда мы сегодня смотрим, допустим, на бои в Мариуполе и то, что вообще происходит на линии соприкосновения в Донбассе, военные корреспонденты, да, в общем-то, все говорят о том, что основной костяк бойцов составляют русскоязычные, жители русскоязычных регионов Украины. Вот здесь вот обнаруживается очень интересный парадокс. С 1991 года там практически безальтернативно устанавливалась вот эта идеология, которая не просто отрицала связи России и Украины, но объявляла Украину, то есть вечно противостоящей России.
So there you see that he starts off this journalist by saying that there's a paradox, which is that, well, they're claiming they're going in to liberate all these Russian-speaking Ukrainians who they claim are Russians, ethnically Russians. They're making that correlate for them in their mind that, yeah, if they speak Russian, then they're Russians. It's a bit like here in Ireland, I guess. Didn't realize we were still all English 100 years after independence. And since I speak English as my first language, and most people in the region, I'm actually in Galway, in the west coast of Ireland. Most people here speak English as the first language, but if you ask them, you're going to find out that nearly all of them think that they're Irish. I would not say maybe 100%, maybe 99.999% of them. And after 30 years of independence in Ukraine, most Ukrainians think that they're Ukrainian. Paradox for him is that they're facing the stiff resistance from these Russian speakers in the east that they're supposed to be trying to liberate. And how are they liberating? Well, actually, they're destroying the cities where they meet resistance because they expected, I guess, for these people to either switch sides. This happened in 2014 in Crimea when Russia annexed Crimea illegally. Part of the armed forces of Ukraine did defect to Russia. And actually, there are reports, and it seems that in parts of the south of Ukraine, like in Kherson and Zaporizhia, that at the beginning of the invasion, that there was also collaborators within the Ukrainian armed forces and security apparatus who switched sides and collaborated or assisted the Russian invaders, which is what this guy expected them all to do, or a large part of them to do, and this hasn't happened.
И когда мы сегодня видим на фронте людей нашего языка, нашей культуры, которые воюют против нас, в этом и проблема. Проблема идеологической обработки и идеологического восприятия, когда они олицетворяют для себя, не будучи националистом, они принимают на себя эту маску. И вот это то, с чем придется работать.
So there he says there's an ideological problem. These people are fighting against us. So in his mind, well, how can they do that? For him, they're Russians, even though they're Ukrainians and they're fighting against the Russian invaders.
Это не устраняется одномоментно. И это придется каким-то образом переламывать. Поэтому, когда сегодня вот говорят, давайте быстрее, давайте скорее, надо понимать вот какую вещь. Даже достижение военного успеха на той или иной территории еще не является окончательным решением задачи.
I mean, the fact he used the word final solution, if that's what he really means, again, genocide talk, just like the Nazis used for their final solution of Jews, genocide in extermination camps.
Потому что работать с населением освобожденных территорий, чем дальше, тем больше будет труднее. Потому что если Донбасс это еще понимает, то, например, на Херсонщине там гораздо более сложная ситуация. Поэтому впереди еще большие трудности, к которым надо готовиться.
So basically he's talking about re-education. So these re-education camps, again, that echoes the language in that RIA Novosti genocide article. So there you see it being repeated. And he's talking about Kherson because in Donbass they had more support, Donbass being Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but in Kherson they have very little. They have some collaborators, but in general they have very little support locally, and they're basically trying to Russify it. That's no surprise to me because I've been to Kherson a lot, and yeah, if you look at the election results, pro-Russian parties before this invasion didn't have a huge amount of support. I think it was like in the 20s, maybe it's less actually than 20%. So why are they expecting, if 80% of the population vote for pro-Ukrainian parties, yeah, why? And that support for Russia is almost certainly going to be a lot less today than it was before the invasion because Putin went on TV and he started telling Ukrainians they're not allowed to basically be independent or be a nation or be a people. And this is all echoed in this kind of language. And then they unleashed this war and killed tens of thousands of people, if not 100,000 already. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong and it's not that as many as that, but probably we're hurtling towards that point. And yeah, believe it or not, that doesn't make people support you as much. That makes them hate you probably, so the support is probably even less.
Понимаете, сегодня много Украин, нет уже одной Украины. Западная Украина, польская Украина, Украина, говорящая на суд.
А должна быть одна и вся наша.
So that is Olga Skabyeva, who is, again, one of these leading propagandists on Russian TV, news anchors, I guess we call it, but for the purposes of this war, well, it's obviously propaganda. That doesn't mean that all propaganda is false, I know. And there's propagandists on all sides, just to be clear, but this is effectively what she does. She says there should be one Ukraine, ours in its entirety. She's basically saying Ukraine shouldn't exist without being under Russian occupation. It's an example of eliminating Ukrainians on primetime TV. And as a final clip, I'll play you some parts from the Duma Deputy Defense Committee Chairman, Vladimir Shamanov. He's a former commander-in-chief of the Russian airborne troops, and he's accused of actually being a war criminal, but he still receives the status. He wasn't convicted, but that was from the Chechen Wars, if I understand correctly, which was similar behavior in terms of the other war crimes outside of genocide that we see today.
Надо до конца будет демилитаризовать Украину, а это непростой вопрос, который займет от 5 до 10 лет. И второе – это денацификация, которая параллельно будет идти, и формирование власти, которая не запачкала себя с этими неонацистами.
Рано или поздно наша месть вас найдет.
И там они, посмотрим, как они с задницы будут валтузить по этим скамейкам. Да туда еще гвоздей надо будет забить, чтобы вам как рекламу про геморрой показывают, чтобы там им геморрой устроить еще.
There, basically, he talks about committing multiple war crimes. Well, he is a suspected war criminal himself. Yeah, just re-emphasizing another member of the Russian elite, talking about basically genocide against Ukraine indirectly. And many countries have already recognized what's happening as a genocide. Something like Canada, actually the Irish Senate also passed a motion recently. The Baltic states recognize what's happening in Ukraine as a genocide. That doesn't have really any legal weight. That's just how they perceive it. It's like with genocides before the Genocide Convention, like Holodomor in Ukraine or the Armenian genocide. That's a more political thing. But definitely there is a growing number of countries, still small, that consider it already a genocide. And the important thing to remember about the important consequence if it is considered a genocide is there is an obligation under the Genocide Convention to do something about it. And that's why, for example, I think Macron, the French president, made this unfortunate comment where he said, no, let's not talk about it being a genocide, because he's scared that then he'll be under pressure to stop calling Putin on the phone and doing something about stopping the genocide, which is stopping Russia's invasion, because that is an obligation. And that is used as a casus belli because, like Putin before the war, he claimed there was a genocide in Donbass, where he said, well, to understand what happened in Donbass between 2014 and 2022, before this latest invasion, there was a Russian orchestrated war that basically supported a group of locals, and then other people came from Russia, and they basically tried to overthrow the Ukrainian state's authority in parts of the east of Ukraine. So basically it was a war by proxy, you could say, and Russia claimed that there were 14,000 people who died in that war, maybe somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 were civilians, and Putin tried to claim that there was a genocide taking place against the people of Donbass, the Russian people in Donbass. He didn't provide any evidence of that other than saying that the Ukrainian people were getting killed. They're also getting killed by Russian soldiers there, or the Russian-backed soldiers, and there were definitely war crimes being committed, but there isn't any strong case that there was a genocide taking place by Ukrainians. And on top of that, if that's his low bar for a genocide, then what the hell is Putin doing at the moment? Can be nothing other than genocide if he's going to use that low bar for it. So in conclusion, is there a prima facie case for genocide in Ukraine committed by Russia? Well, there are two main elements: the physical acts and the mental intent. The mental intent is normally the harder point to prove, but as I've laid out, there's a lot of evidence with that amongst the Russian leadership. There is the intent to destroy in whole or in part the Ukrainian nation and people. And that those physical acts are taking place right now. And just as a final kicker, I'll read a quote from the Telegram channel of Dmitry Medvedev, because I actually subscribe to it. And this was there 2 days ago. Let's read it out. I hate them. They are bastards and degenerates. They want debt to us, to Russia. And while I'm alive, I will do everything to make them disappear. Doesn't that sound extremely genocidal? In the fullness of time, we're going to see whether the leaders and those who have implemented genocide in Ukraine are going to face justice. One of the hard things is, of course, that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. They have a veto, so it's going to be quite a tricky and difficult legal procedure in order to see if they will ever face trial the leaders in Russia or not. But in the fullness of the time, we will see whether they face consequences. But I know what can end the genocide right now, and that's for Russia to leave, to end this war and leave Ukraine and leave the people alone and stop trying to deny their right to existence and stop killing them when they resist Russification. And to the people of Russia, think about how Germans were perceived at the end of World War II, how the Nazis were perceived. The real Nazis. Is that how you want Russia and Russians to be perceived going forward? Do you want people to associate your nationality with genocide because of the imperial ambitions of the Russian political leadership? And when they meet resistance to that, their solution is somewhat similar to the genocide within Russia of Circassians. It's to destroy the Ukrainian people and nation. Stop this madness. Russians go home. Slava Ukraini, Harom Slava, because Ukraine, Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian language are all a thing, and they all continue to exist. It's day 106 of Ukraine's resistance to Russia's attempt to destroy it.
SAR Experience.